Welcome, everybody. We're going to start. I know, I just did that so suddenly.
Oh, my goodness.
A little bit on time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the last of our 2018...
Microphone, please.
Do you have one?
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Right there.
Oh, this thing.
Those of us who are hiding
Yeah. No, I didn't. I always forget this is it.
here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is the last of our 2018-19 series, so thank you so much for being here. We already are starting to plan our 2019-20, and our first one will be November 8th on the Black Hole from the Black Hole Institute. Thank you, Susan, for that great idea. And we will let you know more as we start planning more. But on to this one. First, thank you to the library, the Wellesley Hills Junior Women's Club for collaborating and sponsoring, and also we're thrilled to be part of the World of Wellesley activities. This is a new topic for the COA, LGBTQ. It's also Gay Pride Month in June, and we're excited to be part of the celebration. I first started doing work building programs for seniors, I think about 9 years ago on LGBT, and I mentioned to my father this, and he said, there are no old LGBT people, or he said gay people. And then he laughed and he realized, well, of course there are. They just weren't allowed to be themselves and come out. And that's why we do this, that everybody should feel comfortable and part of our community. And we're always working ways to change that and make it more of a part of things. Come, have a seat. This is Kathy. She's in my art class. So we also have another program that's coming up. I got to do this a little better. And there's a sign up there, and it's May 17th, and I actually have to look at this. It's called Building Bridges, Learning About Older Adults Who Identify as LGBTQ. And it's May 17th, 1:30 to 2:30. There's a sign-up sheet there. It's limited, and it's going to be led by Lisa Krinsky, who heads up the LGBT Aging Project, who has done amazing work throughout Massachusetts and the country on this. But coming back to tonight for our exciting program, Sarah Praeger is the author of Queer, There, and Everywhere, 23 People Who Changed the World, a book that came out in 2017 from HarperCollins. It received 3-starred reviews, including from Publishers Weekly, and was named a Best Book for Teens by New York Public Library and others. Sarah's also had pieces published in The Atlantic, HuffPost, The Advocate, and others. She lives in Sturbridge with her wife and their 2-year-old daughter. Sarah, welcome.
Hello. I do. Don't worry. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I live in Sturbridge, but I work in Framingham, not far from here. And as my introduction mentioned, I have a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. That's actually an old photo from the day my book came out. My wife, Liz, is a physical therapist. She's due in July with our second daughter. Eleanor is actually a little more grown up now. Although last weekend she told us her name's not Eleanor anymore, it's Princess Lulu. So, and it lasted beyond the weekend. She's still calling herself Princess Lulu, so we'll see how long it lasts. Princess Lulu brushes her teeth. So that's fun and a joy. Eleanor is named after one of the 23 people in my book, Eleanor Roosevelt. And I grew up in Connecticut. We moved to Massachusetts last year. And when I was growing up, it really, really helped me to learn LGBTQ history. I was lucky enough that my school library had some books on it so that I could teach it to myself. And what I learned was that I wasn't the first person to ever feel this way, and that I wasn't alone, and that I had ancestors who cared about me and loved me so much that they made incredible sacrifices so that I could live so safely and openly today. And that these ancestors had changed the world and done incredible things so that I could do that meant that I could do incredible things too. I got role models. I learned resilience and overcoming incredible odds. And all of that gave me so much, which is why I've given a lot of my life to teaching LGBTQ history. So I started in 2013 with my free mobile app, Quist, that shows you what happened today in LGBTQ history. And because of my work on that app, HarperCollins approached me to write a book that came out in 2017. And it's about to be announced. Don't put this on Twitter or anything. So it's not online yet, but my second book on LGBTQ history is coming out a year from now. So Queer There and Everywhere is really aimed for 12 to 18-year-olds and up. This next book is for 8 to 12-year-olds. So tonight, I want to share some stories from Queer There and Everywhere. If we have time and interest, maybe some stories that aren't in Queer There and Everywhere. And basically just think about a side of history that isn't taught in schools, isn't really talked about in many circles, and hopefully learn some cool stuff. First, I want to find out what comes to mind for you when I say LGBTQ history. Maybe a person, an event, a place. You could also say nothing. I was never taught anything about LGBTQ history. Stonewall. How'd I know you were going to say that?
We didn't plan that.
No. Two people said it at once. So does somebody want to say what is Stonewall? What was Stonewall? What is Stonewall?
I know that, I can put into it backwards, that a lot of people who advocated for gay rights was actually the lesbian movement, which doesn't know, and also transvestites.
Yes.
How's that for backwards way?
So it relates to Stonewall. So the gay movement, the lesbian movement, the bisexual movement, the transgender movement, and the asexual movement, and all of the others have been somewhat unified under an umbrella, but often very fractured, especially in Stonewall times. Gay men didn't allow lesbians into their group. Lesbians went and created their own group, but they were not allowed into the women's groups like now. And bisexual people weren't allowed into either group because they were seen as traitors. And trans people weren't included in any of the groups either because they were seen as too out there. It would hurt our cause of our assimilationist, like it's just two moms in the suburbs, or some kind of we're just like you image. A radical trans sex worker movement was not aligned with that. So all of these groups were present at Stonewall, which, does anyone know? Yeah.
Well, it was the first time that there was an attempt to fight back against the numerous police raids that happen on a regular basis.
Yes, so first let's just say the Stonewall Inn is a bar, an LGBTQ establishment in New York City, Greenwich Village. It is still in operation today. And there was a riot that took place there that was an attempt to fight back against the frequent police raids, just like you said. So does anyone know what year that was in? 69. And so this is the 50th anniversary next month. I'm really excited. We're going to be marching with Barnes & Noble in the New York Pride Parade to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Stonewall and go right past it. I'm really psyched. I just looked up a rainbow skirt to buy. So in 1969, it was illegal to be LGBTQ in almost every way possible. It was illegal to cross-dress. Sodomy was illegal. It was illegal to serve alcohol to a congregated group of homosexuals. It was illegal to dance with someone of the same sex. It was, a bar like this was a completely criminal operation, hence the frequent police raids. And it was not the first ever riot for LGBTQ rights, but something about this one in 1969 was a spark that started the revolution that we know as the modern LGBTQ rights movement. A lot of groups formed in 1970 and 1969 after the riot. It was June 1969, which is important to know because now we celebrate Pride in June. June is Pride Month because it is the Stonewall anniversary. It's also important to note that the people, well, there are a few things. One is that there were a lot of amazing nonviolent moments in the LGBTQ rights movement. This was not one of them. This was absolutely a violent riot. Police were trapped inside with Molotov cocktails thrown in, burning the building. Nobody was killed during the riots, but this was a violent revolution. Another thing to know is that this was mostly young people. One of the leaders, Sylvia Rivera, was 17 at the time. And this really was led, especially by trans women of color. Sometimes the face of the movement can be assumed to be white, non-trans gay men who certainly played a part in Stonewall, but I think it's important to know it's a very diverse, in every way, group of young people who fought back against the police after night after night after night of being arrested and abused. They just decided to not take it anymore this night. And when you were arrested on one of these charges, it just completely ruined your life. It would be printed in the paper, which meant you lost your job and lost your housing and lost your family. Some people took their own lives over being arrested at one of these raids at one of these bars. So it was a life and death situation. What else besides Stonewall comes to mind for LGBTQ history? Harvey Milk. Great. Who was he?
He was the first openly gay mayor elected at the major city.
Yeah, he was elected to the Board of City Supervisors in San Francisco. George Moscone was the mayor, and Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk were both assassinated in San Francisco City Hall in the 1970s. Harvey Milk is one of the 23 people in the book, and really just an inspirational figure whose message was to bring everyone hope. He was a national figure, not just a San Francisco figure, and he's a personal hero. And has anyone seen the movie Milk? Maybe? Yeah. They consulted with the LGBT Historical Society on that, and who believes it to be pretty accurate. Harvey's son, didn't have a son, nephew, Stuart Milk, runs the Harvey Milk Foundation today, continuing on his uncle's legacy. Anything else? Act Up. What was that?
During the AIDS crisis,
Yeah.
AIDS coalition to unleash power.
Yeah. So, yeah, we haven't mentioned the AIDS epidemic yet, but ACT UP was an important activist group fighting for, for the government to fund research into HIV/AIDS to save lives, which it didn't do for a long time. Great. I love it. A lot of knowledge in the room. So my next question is, how far back does LGBTQ history go? Great, so ancient Rome. Yeah, Greece and Rome, yeah. Maybe further. Biblical times, yeah. So, I mean, all of human history, yeah. So all of human history for sure. There's some of the ways that we know LGBTQ history goes back even further than those ancient times, is things like the deity on the left, who, I can't pronounce their name, but is a Hindu deity who is half physically male and half physically female. And stone statues have been found in cave temples dating back to pre-2,000 years ago. I forget the year. But we know that the concept of male and female in one body existed even in those times in India. And then the people on the right are Mapuche in Chile, and they are some of the many indigenous Americans who are considered two-spirit. Has anyone ever heard that term? So two-spirit refers to male and female spirit living in one person, and it's more or less an umbrella term that means transgender to Native American communities. And trans identities have been identified in almost every single indigenous American tribe from Canada to Argentina. And these two-spirit people were not just accepted, but revered. And it was seen as a gift that they could embody more than one gender, and that it was a gift from the gods that they were this way. We see in records of colonists arriving to everywhere that wasn't Europe. They would say bisexuality is normal here, there are homosexuals here, the men dress like women or the women dress like men in this society. And they wouldn't say it in those terms. They would say these are sodomites that we will execute for their crime. But it was there again and again in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in Australia. And it wasn't, I mean, really, there was an incredible diversity of queerness, of non-straight identities and transgender identities around the world before white Christian European colonists said there's one way to be. Man and woman are the two genders. Man and woman is the one acceptable kind of love or sexuality. Monogamy is the only way. And so some people think we've been kind of advancing from out of homophobia into liberation in just the last 50 years. But homophobia and transphobia is really something that was around and is still around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it doesn't mean that it was here first. I would say that queerness was. And then my last question, what do the high five and the computer have in common? So I'll give you the best answer I ever got. That was at a library in Connecticut. Digital connection. digits. It was a dad, you know? It's kind of a dad joke. Does anyone have other ideas? So they were both invented by gay people. Yeah. So I want to tell you the story of the inventor of the computer and the inventor of the high five. Has anyone heard of Alan Turing? Yeah. Have you seen The Imitation Game? Yes. So Alan Turing, a British guy, was working on computer science before computers existed, or in a time when computer did not refer to a machine, but a person who did computations. He actually studied at Yale for a while, as well as the great British universities. But when, on the first day of the war, he reported to Bletchley Park for top secret government duty to work on breaking the Nazis' Enigma code. And the movie is right, it changed every day, this code. And you needed to compute an infinite number of possibilities of what the answer might be to cracking this code, but it would reset every 24 hours. So Alan created what he called a universal machine, something that could compute anything. And he used it to compute all of the possible answers to what the Enigma code might be. And it took him over a year to do it, but he and his team did break this code using the universal machine that is now widely considered to be the first computer. And when he broke this code, it's estimated, it's impossible to know really, but estimated to have saved thousands of lives and to have helped secure the Allies' victory, and was a pivotal moment in the war. Unfortunately for Alan, he was also a homosexual. This was illegal in Britain at the time, just like it was almost everywhere, and everywhere that Britain called a colony. He reported a burglary to his house, at his house, and when the police came to investigate, they asked if he had had anyone in his house who has been by your house recently as part of their investigation. He mentioned a gentleman caller that had been by, and when they found out the nature of this man's visit to Alan's home, they dropped the burglary investigation and started investigating him for violating Section 11, which was the anti-homosexuality law. He was convicted of homosexual conduct, and he had the choice between 2 years in prison or chemical castration. To be able to continue his work, he chose to stay out of prison and took forced estrogen injections, which had the goal of dulling his libido and therefore curing his homosexuality. As you can see in the years, these forced injections shortened his life. He was not able to continue his work because as a convicted criminal, he lost his security clearance. His death is considered either to be an accidental poisoning or suicide. He took a bite of a poisoned apple. He was very into the Snow White story, actually. And they never tested the apple, or they never looked into it much to be able to say whether it was a suicide or not. But the hormones just completely messed with his mind. He wasn't able to work anymore, even if he had had the security clearance. His mind was not the same. And I tell Alan's sad story because, I mean, he was pardoned posthumously and given honors when his work was finally declassified long after his death by the Queen and by the Prime Minister just within the last 10 years. But his story is important in part because it shows that homophobia really hurts us all, not just gay people, because imagine what Alan might have invented that could have helped the world if he had been able to live longer, if he had been able to work longer, if homophobia ended his career and his life. But, and that's why, you know, homophobia doesn't just hurt gay people. It hurts all of us because it doesn't allow all of these great minds to participate fully in society. The inventor of the high five is Glenn Burke. He was a player in the majors for just a few years. He was offered a bribe to marry a woman, and when he refused, he was traded away and didn't last that season. He was kind of forced out. And he came out on the Today Show after his MLB career and was active in a gay softball league. He was, from his autobiography, he seems like he was such a great person. Not, I guess anyone would try to portray themselves that way in an autobiography, but the things he says at the end where he just tried to be a good person. He was a Christian, he helped others, and the invention of the high five happened while he was with the Dodgers. His teammate Dusty Baker was coming around, and he just kind of put up his hand, and he said it seemed like the thing to do, and they just high-fived, and the Dodgers trademarked it and started putting it on t-shirts, the high five, and it became a thing in baseball, and then all sports, and then culture at large. It was his first home run in the majors that day. You can see he died in 1995. It was of complications due to AIDS. And I think, you know, both of these inventors of the high five and of the computer, that's one of the, it's really incredible how much the LGBTQ community has given the world, I think. Just like many communities, like we study Women's History Month or Black History Month for the contributions of so many different groups. And it's, I mean, Glenn's partner saw the high five as a gay pride symbol of two men's hands touching. Glenn didn't see it that way as anything gay, but I think that's an interesting anecdote too. Since both of those men had relatively sad stories, I want to tell you a happy story before we move on to Q&A. I do have a bunch of other stories prepared if we want to go beyond Alan and Glenn and Christina, but we'll break for Q&A and see how it goes. So I would like to read to you the Christina Vasa story. Has anyone heard of Christina of Sweden? One person, two people, great. So you can see Christina's years up there. The book has a portrait of each person to start, and their years and a little mini one-line summary. Each chapter stands alone, so you're not missing anything to start at the fourth. Okay. Christina slowed their horse from a high-speed gallop as they approached the Swedish border. There was no turning back now. Dismounting, Christina took off their dress and changed into men's clothing. They chopped off their hair to chin length and buckled on a sword. Christina's temporary transformation to a male persona was now complete. From here on out, the name was Count Christoph von Donia. Hours ago, Christina had been the ruler of all of Sweden. Now, 28-year-old Christoph was about to stow away into Denmark anonymously. A fast note on pronouns. They was not used during Christina's time, but we've used this gender-neutral pronoun for Christina because they were vocal about not feeling entirely female. Christina was a star at playing with gender from the moment of their birth. King Gustavus and his wife Maria were overjoyed when court astrologers predicted that pregnant Maria would give birth to a boy, an heir. And for several moments after Christina entered the world, the baby's parents got to live out that fantasy. The nurses announced that a prince had been born. But then the nurses took another look. The baby was hairy and loud, too hairy and loud to be a girl, they'd initially thought, but nonetheless it was a girl. Maria was crushed while Gustavus smiled and said, "I hope this girl will be as good as a boy." From the way the king raised Christina, you'd think he never got the memo about not having a male heir. Christina was just like the son Gustavus had always wanted, playing with toy soldiers instead of dolls, learning to hunt, wearing men's jackets over their dresses, swearing like a sailor, and sometimes pretending to twirl an invisible mustache. Walking by ladies at the palace, Christina would bow and tip their hat as a man would do. Being royalty, they were never called out for being eccentric. But Christina didn't have much time to enjoy a carefree childhood. Gustavus was killed in battle when Christina was only 6. At 14, Christina started attending meetings of the Swedish leadership, and an advisor ruled as a placeholder until the young queen came of age at 18. Christina always had their nose stuck in a book, and often studied just for fun. They got up before dawn to read before governing a country all day. Then, once they became queen, they prioritized science, literature, philosophy, and other lofty subjects in their court. Christina bought entire libraries from other countries and held philosophical discussions every Thursday night. All this put Christina on the map as one of the most educated women in the world during that time. Not to mention that they ended the 30 Years' War, the very war their father had died in, and brought peace at long last. All the while, Christina refused to abide by gender norms, straddling male and female. Christina once wrote, "As a young girl, I had an overwhelming aversion to everything that women do and say. I couldn't bear their tight-fitting, fussy clothes. I took no care in my complexion or my figure or the rest of my appearance. I never wore a hat or a mask and scarcely ever wore gloves. I despised everything belonging to my sex, hardly excluding modesty and propriety. I couldn't stand long dresses, and I only wanted to wear short skirts. What's more, I was so hopeless at all the womanly crafts that no one could ever teach me anything about them." Christina even said in their memoir that women weren't worthy of ruling a country. Quote, "It is almost impossible that a woman should perform the duties required on the throne. The ignorance of women, their feebleness of mind, body, and understanding makes them incapable of reigning. Yikes." But Christina certainly saw themselves as capable, so were they the exception to the rule, or not a woman at all? There are many ways to answer that question. If Christina had lived during our time, they might have identified as a transgender man, or a cisgender woman, or genderqueer, or something else altogether. They also may have been intersex. Since they lived in a time without our terms, there is no modern label to pin on them. You'd think a super ambitious and busy person like Christina would have had no time for silly distractions like love or sex, and you would have been right. But then Aba came along. Aba Spar was a woman so beautiful, Christina nicknamed her Belle. Rumors about their relationship circulated through the court's gossip mill. Christina felt a tenderness toward Aba that they didn't have for their other friends. The two often shared a bed, though this wasn't unusual for unmarried ladies of the time. Christina once wrote to Aba from abroad, declaring, In whatever part of the world I may be, I shall never cease to think of you. If I may never see you again, I shall always love you. While I live, I will not cease to love you. But we know rulers don't always get to choose who they end up with. Even if Ava had been a man, she didn't have the right lineage or clout to merit a permanent place by Christina's side. Christina was trapped. Queens must marry men, the right men. Christina didn't exclusively love women, but the queen did exclusively love their own independence. In the end, only one man came close to winning their hand, their cousin, Charles Gustavus. Christina cared deeply for Ava and Charles, as well as one or two others at different times throughout their life, but had more interest in romance than sex. Christina once wrote to Charles, "My love is so strong that it can only be overcome by death, and if, which God forbid, you should die before me, my heart shall remain dead for every other. My mind and affection shall follow you to eternity, there to dwell with you." And the Diet, the Swedish equivalent of a Congress or Parliament, would have been perfectly happy with Charles as king, but Christina said they could not bear to be used by a man the way a peasant uses his field, and they certainly could not bear to be married. Though Christina declared over and over they would never marry, the Diet simply wouldn't believe it. Convention dictated she would settle down when she found the right man. Christina told the Diet they would do no such thing, saying they felt such a repulsion toward the marital state that they would rather choose death than a man. Ultimately, Christina made the impossible choice to give up the throne. If they wouldn't marry, they couldn't be queen, and they did not want to get married. The power, the father's legacy, the entire 131-year-old royal house of Vasa, over. In the end, Christina made Charles king after all, just not as their spouse. The Diet begged, the country mourned, and Christina rejoiced. They were free. Free. No more answering to others, no more compromising, no more pressure to marry. A blank canvas lay ahead, and Christina could paint it however they wanted. As they rode across the border out of Sweden and into Denmark, they yelled out, "I am free at last." Now, Christina didn't ride off entirely alone. Ever the expert at political negotiation, Christina had secured themselves a salary for life, servants, and some land and power too. Not bad. Christina chose to settle in Rome, dropping the traveler disguise and returning to their given name. They continued to cheerfully disregard gender norms their entire life, wearing both male and female clothing and romancing both men and women. After giving up so much to be able to live the way they chose, Christina died peacefully after a full and free life. Any reactions to Christina's story? Yes?
Yeah, I think it's kind of ironic that she settled in Rome. And isn't she buried in the Vatican?
She's buried in the Vatican.
She converted to Catholicism?
Yes, this was a major part of their story, and condensing someone's life to 6 pages meant, especially with focusing on their gender and sexuality, meant that I didn't tell that a large part of Christina's, so much of European politics at that time was if you were Protestant or Catholic, and Christina chose Catholicism and is buried in the Vatican. But yeah, I don't get into the politics or the first draft I wrote of Christina. Christina was the first chapter I wrote, and it was 15 pages for the first third of their life. And my editor was like, nope. And that's when I started learning how to write for teens. And I put off Christina for a while, and the first chapter I actually got accepted after months of submitting drafts was the Frida Kahlo chapter. And my editor was finally like, yes, this has emotion, this has the anecdotes, and wanted just feelings, because it's teens and they have feelings. So um, trying to find that in the historical record when Christina was easier as a royal, having memoirs and people writing about them because they're a royal. It was just easier because they actually said how they felt about stuff. Other people, you have to create emotion without actually saying that the person felt it because you don't actually have proof that they felt that way for nonfiction.
I think another interesting footnote is, in the 1930s, Greta Garbo made a movie, Queen Christina,
Yeah.
where Greta Garbo's personal life was somehow in question.
Well, Greta is not one of the 23 people in the book, but does appear as the lover of Mercedes de Acosta, who is one of the 23 people in the book. So Queen Christina is a 1933 film, and I almost forgot, I wanted to show you guys. This is about 1 to 2 minute clip of Greta Garbo playing Christina of Sweden. Note the clothing, not what you might expect of a 1600s queen, more masculine. And then there's just like a few great lines, but this is Christina discussing with their advisor having to get married.
Snow again. Eternal snow.
Your Majesty, it is for Sweden. It is your duty.
Why is it my duty? My days and nights are given up to the service of the state. I am so cramped with duty that to be able to read a book, I have to rise in the middle of the night. I serve the people with all my thoughts, with all my energy, with all my dreams, waking and sleeping. I do not wish to marry, and they cannot force me.
You must give Sweden an heir.
Not by chance, Chancellor.
You are Sweden's queen. You are your father's daughter.
Must we live for the dead?
For the great dead? Yes, Your Majesty.
Snow is like a wide sea. One could go out and be lost in it and forget the world and oneself.
There are rumors that Your Majesty is planning a foreign marriage.
They're baseless.
But, Your Majesty, you cannot die an old maid.
I have no intention to, Chancellor. I shall die a bachelor.
So good. Let me see if this brings up this one other. Yes.
Ebba, come in.
Now, don't dally, Your Majesty. You have a busy day.
Morning, Ebba. What are you doing up so early?
I couldn't sleep.
That means you're either happy or unhappy. Which is it?
That
Happy.
happened in the 1933 movie. So thank you for bringing that up because I almost forgot to show those clips. But Greta Garbo is in my next book as bisexual, and there's a 2016 maybe indie film about Queen Christina as well. Yes.
I have a question. So the thing we just saw the play Indecent, and the focus of it is on the first lesbian kiss in a play. Have you followed that at all?
Not Indecent. I have not. I feel like I've heard about that because it was on Broadway.
It's based on a Yiddish author. Peg, you're always much better with details.
Yeah.
Their whole controversy, and then they got arrested because they were doing an indecent play with
Yeah.
Broadway,
Yeah.
but in the
I mean, I know they're,
1930s.
yeah.
But it toured all through Europe and didn't create that sort of controversy.
Well, you know, a lot of authors would go to Europe first when indecency laws prevented them from having their pieces come out in the US. I know. I imagine the same would be true for artists of all kinds.
You are going to tell us about Abe Lincoln, though, right?
Well, Abe Lincoln is in my book. He's not in my presentation, but now that somebody asked about him, I will. Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Joshua Fry Speed is the focus of his chapter. They shared a bed together for 4 years. People often say that, like, you have to think of the historical context of men sharing a bed in their time was not necessarily sexual because beds were a luxury. So you just, you know, got as many people in one as possible, and didn't really mean anything because they were such a scarcity and such a luxury. But as I point out in the chapter, Joshua was a bed salesman, and there was no shortage of beds for him. Abraham Lincoln came in on his horse to Springfield, Illinois, to set up his law practice, and went to go buy a bed, and this guy just said, "Why don't you just stay with me instead?" And they did for 4 years, and it goes on to explain the letters between them after Joshua left, and I do not claim that Abraham was bisexual or gay or any modern term, but I do include him in the book, which says that I can consider the love that these two men had to be under an umbrella of, well, it's an example of male-male love. And whether or not we can ever prove that, we can't prove that they had sex or anything like that, I think it's clear that their love is worth knowing about. There was another guy in DC, Derek, but Joshua was a really important person in Abraham Lincoln's life in more ways than a friend, I believe. And I think it's important that we often assume historical figures to be straight by default, straight until proven otherwise, instead of coming at history with an open mind and not saying that they're straight unless proven otherwise, but they're nothing unless proven any way possible. And since people don't really keep logs and diaries of every single crush they ever have, or every hookup they ever have, or anything like that, there's often no way to know. There is interpretation to be done in history work. And I think that, like, often interpretation is too skewed towards our assumptions of what makes us comfortable. And we hesitate to give great historical figures a sexuality at all, but these people did date and get married and have their hearts broken, and lust, and because they were humans, not great historical figures on a pedestal, which is why everybody is called by their first name in my book, including Abraham, not President Lincoln. and to help make them more approachable. And I think that's important for teens or any reader to realize that anyone can achieve greatness, because these folks are just humans as well. Yes?
Well, can we go back a couple of years to Buchanan?
Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about a gay president, yeah, for sure, Buchanan.
I mean, there's no question
I agree. I wanted, Buchanan didn't make it into my second book either, because I'm trying to tell stories of his presidency just wasn't that successful, and I'm trying to tell he was gay, but
Not every gay person is exceptional in themselves.
exactly. That's the truth. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yes?
What inspired you to name your daughter after
Yeah. Well, my wife has always loved Eleanor Roosevelt quotes. She just has some really great ones about no one can make you feel inferior without your consent, and she kind of was always drawn to Eleanor Roosevelt's words. And I was pregnant with Eleanor while writing the book, and just kind of fell in love with her quiet leadership and strength. I learned a lot about her as a woman who had only female journalists at her own press conferences, because Franklin only allowed male journalists at his press conferences, and was the first lady to have press conferences. And her own My Day column, soapbox, and just really admired her as a person. We also were really into this YA book, Eleanor and Park, while I was pregnant, and the name kept coming up, and I think Eleanor Roosevelt's story that one's a lot more clear-cut than Abraham's, the letters between her and Lorena are very explicit. So yeah, I was kind of hoping to name our child after not necessarily somebody in the
You can't move.
It's kind of in and out.
Yeah.
Oh, it's died.
Yeah.
It's just off now. Okay.
That should work for you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Are there other questions? Yes.
You want to talk about Leonardo da Vinci?
Sure. There are, a lot of people. I'm more and more convinced, there's so many people. Yeah, Leonardo da Vinci is in there too. The evidence for him was a sodomy case brought against him. I chose not to include him because I didn't think it was quite as airtight. And because anyone can bring a sodomy charge against anyone. No one was there to witness it. And while there's other things that make me very comfortable, including him under a list of LGBTQ people, there wasn't enough facts that I could have told in a chapter about him that I was sure about that were LGBTQ specific, which is what I was looking for the book. You're surprised?
Several of the biographies of Da Vinci include a lot of amazing, intimate stories.
Okay. next time. So I think, yeah.
So I just want to say something, I guess, more than a question.
Okay.
I remember being exposed to LGBT history when I was like 9, like 98.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm just saying, like, when I was first exposed to LGBT histories, like late 90s, I was like 9 years old. And I remember making this really unfortunate connection as a child that being a gay person meant that you ended your life. Like, I just remember connecting that history with, like, hyper tragedy. And then in high school, being, like, so nervous about being part of that community because those people just didn't.
So often the stories that got told were not only your life is going to end in suicide, but it's going to end in murder, it's going to end in, like, mass execution, it's going to...
Like, positive stories, like, even just Christina's story just is so valuable, like, because it's not an easy history to tell, but...
Yeah. So, you know, thank you for bringing it up. There's so much tragedy and tragedy in LGBTQ history. And that was one of the main, in choosing the 23 people, there were so many, I had a list of well over 100 people that I was working from, and I wanted a mix of different time periods, different fields, different genders, different races, different geographies, different everything, but also I wanted to make sure not every story ended in something like suicide. And so I sought out happy endings, and even, you know, one of the stories tells of World War II on the other side of the English Channel, an Austrian guy who was sent to a concentration camp for homosexuality, as thousands were. And his story is one of survival and finding a partner and living to an old age. And so even though his story I had to tell that part of LGBTQ history, I tried to find a person from that history who could have a happy ending. I think that's important.
Any other happy stories?
Let's see. Yeah. Let me see. Who's happy? No. No. So Albert Cashier was a trans male Civil War soldier who immigrated from Ireland and ditched the dress and the female identity at the docks in Ireland and lived as male the rest of their life, and died of natural causes at an old age. And even when their body was discovered to be physically, like, assigned female at birth, when they died, his brothers in arms came back and said, no, he's a man, and had him buried in his military uniform with the name Albert on his headstone instead of his female name from birth, and made sure that that was respected. And that was 18 something. So that was pretty cool. Bayard Rustin lived to an old age, worked on LGBT equality in the 80s after dedicating his life in the 40s, 50s, 60s to the civil rights movement, the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama posthumously. His partner, Walter, accepted it on his behalf. Yeah. And there's a few people who are still alive in this book. The last one chronologically is George Takei from Star Trek, who is like, a 70-something-year-old guy who's turned into a social media phenomenon after being in a Japanese internment camp as a child, and coming out very late in life. Finding happiness with his husband after fighting for marriage equality together. Let's see. Well, it's after 8, and I have to return the book stuff by 9, so I'm happy to talk more. Offline, I'll be signing books right over here. And thank you so much for your time, attention, and questions tonight.
I was going to say, let's give a big thank you, but we just did. We can do another one, though. That was great. Yeah, please come over, say hello, have a refreshment, look at some of the information that we have, sign up for our May 17th event. It should be wonderful. Lisa Krinsky, if you haven't ever met her or gone to something that she's led, she's just amazing. And we look forward to seeing you back in November at our Black Hole Initiative talk. Thank you so much.